What's up, everybody? Roger Herson, official Beverly Witch. And for this episode, we are going to be talking about a statue that seems to confuse a lot of people. It's in Salem. If you know about Salem, then you know about that statue in front of the Salem Witch Museum. Now, before I say who it is, the average person, most people look at that statue as tourists. Even like you'd be surprised how many locals go, "What? That's not a witch." No, it's not a witch. Yes, it might look like what you think a witch is, with the big, billowy cloak and the tall hat. But the statue is of Roger Conant, not of a witch. What he is dressed as is what Henry. Oh man, I gotta look. I always get hitched up on his middle name. It's Henry Hudson Kitson. I always want to say Henry Hitson Cutson, or I always mix that up. It's Henry Hudson Kitson, and he built that statue in 1913. It was paid for by I believe it's like an organization tied to the Conant family, and they paid to have that statue made. Henry Hudson Kitson was also the same man who built the statue of the Minuteman that's now at Arlington, in Arlington, Massachusetts. So he's a well-known art sculptor. Sorry, just listen to me today. Sculptor at the time. So he was really just envisioning, because we don't have any sort of proof or anything that tells us, what Roger Conant looked like. We just have an idea of how they dressed. So he just envisioned what he would have imagined Roger Conant to look like, with the tall Puritan hat and the big billowy cloak. I do like to point out a couple of things here. The main one being, first and foremost, that it is interesting to me that is how our mind now sees a witch. And I want to point out that was a very masculine way to dress, as you can see, right? That the tall hat and the cloak, whatnot, and the boots. But the tall hat was also something that Quaker preacher women wore in the 17th century. They would wear a tall hat, and they had this sort of little mini cape cloak thing. There's images of it. I'll try to pull one up, and if I can, I'll show it online. And this is basically what they dressed as, and then they would wear the boots. Now imagine, in 17th century society, Puritan society, a Quaker woman preaching. That's what? First of all, the Quakers were hated by the Puritans. Well, along with everybody else. But they were really hated by the Puritans. So and that was bad enough. The idea of a woman preaching, Anne Hutchinson, who is covered in another episode, she was exiled for preaching in her home. So that gives you a very good idea. And she was a Puritan-minded woman. So that gives you an idea of, like, just how much they have no tolerance for Quakers and for women preaching. So you now have women preaching a Quaker message that, to them, that's like a servant of the devil. And so for a Puritan mind, that's what they're going to envision as a servant of the devil. You see where I'm going with this? And what did they believe witches to be? Servants of the devil. So the very fact that to this day we connect that tall hat and that big cloak to a witch, that's something to think about, isn't it? But I digress. Just a little brain candy for you. Moving back to Roger Conant. Roger Conant was born in East Budleigh, East Devon, England. By the way, I typed out the timeline here from my own notes, but I'm also going to provide them in along with the video and everything. So if you want to read for yourself, it's all going to be there, along with you know, along with all the sources that I've used, like links to them. And I'm also going to be showing some pictures along the way, so you don't have to look at my face the whole time. So, Roger Conant, he was born in East Budleigh, East Devon, England in 1592. In the early 1620s, he was a dry salter in London. I'm only going to breeze through this for the sake of time. I'm not going to get really deep into his life. He was a dry salter in London in the early 1620s. He arrived in Plymouth in 1623, 1624, and with his wife Sarah Horton Conant. He This is where I kind of get into. We don't even know that he was a Puritan. We don't. I don't. I don't think he was. I think a lot of people probably agree that he was not a Puritan by every definition of the word. Especially since he often sort of gets moved out of Puritan society because of how orthodox and fanatical they are, where they want to sort of have a harder edge towards natives, for example. Conant is a much gentler soul. So 1624-25, he moved from Plymouth to Nantasket, and then he ends up in Cape Ann, and that is modern-day Gloucester, which is just north of us. 1626, they established. Actually, I want to pause here before I get into this. At one point, when they're up in Cape Ann, there had been earlier fishing stages set up by pilgrims up down in Plymouth, and they had left them behind, and they were just kind of left there not being used. So when these new colonists came up with Roger Conant, they built their own fishing stages, but they also started utilizing the fishing stages of the prior pilgrims. I don't know, to be honest, who was there before Roger Conant. I plan to look into that more, but be that as it may, at one point in time in the 1623 to 1624 to 1625 period, Miles Standish, a well-known pilgrim leader, came up to what is now Gloucester. We'll just call it Nomkeg because that's what they were called it. They saw the new colonists or new settlers using their old stages, their old fishing stages. And Standish, who was known at the time for being an undersized but very bad tempered man, so he's a short man with a bad temper, started to get angry enough to the point where it was going to become violent until Roger Conant stepped in and said, hey, you know what? I personally will build you new fishing stages so that this will solve the problem. You can almost imagine Roger Conant coming in and be like, look, okay, fine, here, I'll build you a new toy, okay? It's crazy. But it earned the respect of a lot of the Puritans there and a lot of the leaders. So he ended up serving as the first governor of Cape Ann, and that was in 1626. They established the settlement of Nomkeg. So he served as governor from 1626 to 1628. He'd moved from what is now Gloucester to what would become Salem. And he served there as governor until 1628, when John Endicott came in and became the first sort of official governor of the colony. So when he gets there, Conant was sort of settled on the northern shores of Salem, right by the Bass River. So sort of like, imagine he's already settled there and he's looking out over what would become Beverly. And he's happily steps down for John Endicott. But I have to, again, more research needs to be done on this, but there was a lot of friction initially between the new people coming in and Roger Conant and his planter settle his fellow planter settlers. I'm so bad at this. Anyways, so there's some chaos there, and they're struggling to come to terms with how they're going to coexist. Eventually they get through it and they form sort of an agreement, and it's at that point that they form that agreement that they decide, because they've come together in peace, they decide to rename Namkeg as Salem, as peace. Jerusalem being the city of police, peace. uh, they took that name. So that's how Salem gets his name. Pretty cool, huh? Anyways, so they're there until about, well, Conant and a few other families are there until about 1635. And then he and four other families decide to cross, we call them the old planters. They decide to cross the Bass River to settle on the Bass River side. And that's the beginning, early beginnings of what would become Beverly. Now, they're still technically Salem. So they all go to church on the other side of the river. And so they have to now cross the river every Sunday or every church day when it's time for church. And that becomes, over time, that becomes, more and more people have to settle and have to move over there. It becomes more and more dangerous. There's more and more people putting their lives at risk. And eventually, the people on Bass Riverside are starting to say, we need our own. Wenham had already had theirs. I believe in 1670s, they were given their own church. Wenham was even further north than, there was a town north of Beverly. So Beverly was there. The people on Bass Riverside now, they're now saying, we don't want to have to keep crossing the river. And eventually they were allowed. They were basically said, okay, you can establish your own church. This makes you your own town. Reverend John Hale was the first official reverend of Beverly. We're covering him a lot in this podcast, so I'm not going to get too much into that. He was the first reverend. And they established themselves as a town of Beverly. And that was in 1667, 1668. In 1671, Roger Conant, this is one of my favorite stories about Roger Conant, because if he'd had his way, we would not be called Beverly. We'd be called Budley. Because, remember where he was born? East Budley, East Devon, England. Well, in 1671, he and a few others petitioned the General Court to rename Beverly Budley. He was denied. Roger Conant died in 1679 at the age of 87. And so there you have it. That's Roger Conant. Now, I want to point out that point where I was talking about he came over to Bass Riverside in 1635. You'll notice at one point in this video, I started showing new pictures. And if you read along, you could see. Here in Beverly, right where the Cumming Center is, we have a place called the Shoe Pond. And right along that Shoe Pond is what we call the Planter's Path. And that was when they came into Bass Riverside. They came in there. That was the landing point, and that path is what they used. It was at one point an old street. The path was paid for, I believe, by the city of Beverly, as well as, I think, what else was Historic Beverly was involved. Oh, and the Cumming Center. So I was forgetting names. So the city of Beverly, Historic Beverly, and the Cumming Center all kind of work together to. I think it's that Historic Beverly does actually occasionally do tours along that route, which I think is great. I don't know when they're doing it next, but I hope to do that one, because that would fascinate me. But these pictures that you've seen, these are along that path. It's definitely like, if you're coming to Salem and you can get over to the Cumming Center and visit Shoe Pond, take that path. I mean, you see in the pictures, it's you almost forget that you're in the middle of a city. It's so gorgeous, it's quiet, it's peaceful. And you can almost imagine that you're back, except for the cement pathway, to be honest. But you can almost imagine that you're back in that time. You almost forget that there are houses around, that there's civilization around. Shoe Pond has a fascinating history about Beverly that I always encourage people to look into, uh, especially as an aside. If you're going to go visit Shoe Pond, make sure you also look up Schubert the seal, and I'll maybe add in a little bit more on that one too. So there you go, everybody. Not a witch, an old planter named Roger Conant, settler, founder, peacekeeper. Blessed be.